welcome to this evening's webinar, All Will Be Well. Also, this webinar is being recorded and it is being shown live, so it's here in Brisbane. It is 6 p.m. So thank you so much for everybody in Australia and everybody around the world for subscribing, for registering for this wonderful webinar. I've been so excited to present this for such a long time. You know, when you get so excited that you almost end up becoming very nervous. Disclaimer that I need to make: I'm not a historian. I'm not overtly religious at all, by no means, but I'm very spiritual. I actually put together last year, and I will be talking about this book for this evening, and we'll be referencing some of the work in volume 3, The Psyche and the Subtle, of the 3rd edition of the Complete Guide. But more importantly, I wanted to mention that sadly, I have not had the opportunity to ever visit Norwich. I do hope one day to visit Norwich. But tonight, I want to talk more about the work of Julian of Norwich and how I have related it to aromatherapy. Now I'm having some, oh, there we go. Now, just a couple of little other promotions. There will be more webinars that you will be able to register for and join. I think the Sustainably Sourced Essential Oils webinar, you can already register for that. I've thrown in a couple of extra webinars that I will be doing throughout the year, such as aromatherapy in the immune system. There will be one in which I talk about aromatherapy in Shinrin-yoku, talking about incense, rare and Japanese oils, aromatherapy and the zodiacs. And then for the International Gratitude Day, I will be doing an event which looks at the science behind gratitude and how it relates to well-being. And then the last webinar for the year will be Zen of Blending. Now, of course, don't forget that if you don't already have, but I imagine that many of you already have my books, thank you so much. But please, all my books are available on perfectpotion.com.au. If you are in America, in North America, NAHA have all stock all my books, and in the UK and probably throughout Europe, it might save a little bit of postage, but we do have some very good offers for you if you want, in terms of saving on shipping. But in the UK, also the IFA stock the Complete Guide and Aromatherapy book. Now, this evening's presentation is All Will Be Well. I'm sure you have all heard that term. It was actually a term that was coined by Julian of Norwich. Now, what I have done is I've related her wisdom, her revelations, and explored their meaning through the work of others and how they relate. And I've made a relationship with many of these revelations that she's made and associated them with the various essential oils. So in this webinar, what I would like to cover is, I would like to start off because yesterday was International Women's Day. So if you're watching this at a later date, that is the 8th of March, 2022. I want to explain why I believe that Julian of Norwich is very, very important for the main focus and the main theme of this year's International Women's Day. I want to talk about reclaiming the feminine in spirituality and healing. And indeed, that is one thing that I discuss extensively in chapter 1, Re-Shamanizing Aromatherapy of the Complete Guide to Aromatherapy. I want to talk about how aromatherapy essentially is a feminine practice and how aromatherapy embraces the feminine. Now, I'll explain this further throughout the presentation. I want to explore who actually was Julian of Norwich, and what we can learn from her, and especially how we can better understand the more subtle qualities of aromatherapy through the wisdom of Julian of Norwich. I was actually thinking that this could end up being an entire one-day workshop, but I will keep it short. Now, I just want to highlight to you the main campaign theme of 2022's International Women's Day the campaign theme. And I think it's wonderful and quite inspiring. Imagine a gender equal world. Imagine a world free of bias, stereotypes and discrimination, a world that is diverse, equitable and inclusive. A world where difference is valued and celebrated. Together, we can forge women's equality. Collectively, we can all break the bias. And breaking the bias is the key theme of this year's International Women's Day. Even though Julian's work is over 600 years old, her revelations play a very big role in helping to break the bias that has long existed in society. I have known Julian for a very short time. And I was actually, when I discovered her work, it was like I was so upset because I said, why hadn't I learned about her earlier in my life? But at the same time, I was extremely grateful that I had been able to discover her work. Let me tell you the story of how I discovered her work. I was actually putting together my presentation last year for aromatherapy and mental health masterclass. We were at that time here in Australia, in the middle of a lockdown. So I felt, and I was so aware, we'd been discussing this, and we were so aware and conscious of the effects that the lockdown due to the pandemic was having on people's mental health. And so I decided to explore, especially that relationship between spirituality and how it can play such an important role in helping us to maintain, to helping us flourish, and to help to nurture our mental health. I remember Googling and typing in the words pandemic, and I think I typed in spirituality, then mental health. And I was surprised that in the top 5 searches was this book about Julian of Norwich. And don't know, something just drew me to it. I clicked on it and started reading, and I was fascinated. Within half an hour, I made an online purchase of that book. And I was so excited to have finally discovered Julian of Norwich. Now, there are so many excellent books out there. What you're going to get this evening is just a very short version of Julian of Norwich. Some of the books focus on her works, and some of them will have the entire content of her work. Some will just have a selection. Some will explain and they'll be annotated, and so you will be able to better understand the terminology. Some have been translated into a more contemporary English. Some have remained in the more original English format. It's up to you to find the book that you will resonate. So please, I'm just giving you a sample of some of the books, and in the actual, please go to the blog. You'll see a complete list of the books that I have discovered, and I've read several of them now. I've read most of, but not all of the revelations of divine love. And I'll expect there's some wonderful advice if you want to actually read her revelations, the revelations of divine love. I do sincerely believe that reading about Julian of Norwich can really help us to explore and connect deeper with the more subtle qualities of aromatherapy. There was this, by the way, and I think you can still get this book. This was one of the original texts that was translated. When I say the original text, one of the original 20th century texts that was translated by Grace Warwick in 1901. It is still available. From what I understand, it can be a little bit more challenging to read because it's written in a more original, older style of English. I found this particular translation quite interesting. It has the entire revelations of divine love, but it also has an excellent introduction into to highlight the historical context regarding the period in which Julian of Norwich lived. And this was only published in 2015. You'd be surprised to know that most of the books that are published have been written about Julian. It's been in the last decade or 2 decades of this that we're speaking of. Very interesting, and we'll look into that a little bit further and explain why that might be the case. This was the book that I discovered. Now, this book, by the way, it's a gorgeously written book. And a lot of the presentation refers to the work of Matthew Fox. This book doesn't actually have the entire revelations of divine love in it, but it gives you a very good modern interpretation of the Julian of Norwich's work. And more importantly, I love the way that Matthew Fox has addressed the issue of saying, this was published at the beginning of the pandemic, feeling, and where he talks about, here is a person who 600 years ago lived her entire life during the period of what we call the Black Death, the Black Plague, a pandemic. What can we, and this person wrote, she was a mystic, and she wrote extensively about her experience. What can we learn from her today as we live through a pandemic? This is worth checking out, and I will be talking about this further. And perhaps, and normally, normally when you get, you're reading about the books, you skim over, the book praises at the beginning of at the front of the book, but I just couldn't help myself reading some of the book praises. And I want to share with you this particular one, which was by Gloria Steinem in this book by Matthew Fox. Suppose you had a wise woman friend who was a scholar and also a survivor of a plague many times longer and more lethal than the one that is going on now. Wouldn't you like to know what she has to say? Thanks to Matthew Fox, we can find a friend in Julian of Norwich, exactly the mental, emotional, and spiritual vaccine we need now. Isn't that gorgeous? The way she describes the work of Julian of Norwich as a mental, emotional, and spiritual vaccine. Now, I must admit, I was also going through some of the online reviews of Matthew Fox's modern day, and I will say modern day interpretation of Julian's work, and I found some reviews that were very critical of his interpretation. One reviewer, for example, states, Julian has become fashionable over the last few decades, particularly with academics. And Julian's writings have been used selectively to support current ideas about life and spirituality. This reviewer, by the way, is correct when they say that Julian could not have had known about the concept of climate change or global warming, and she was not a feminist. That's true. However, what the reviewer has failed to understand is that her work is eternal. It is wisdom. It's from the heart. And when you read words, something that was written 600 years ago, and you can still relate to those experiences in the 21st century, and those words provide you with that impetus to deal with some of the challenges that we face today, such as climate change, breaking the bias, inequalities, and pandemics, then I think the reviewer has probably missed the point in terms of how to interpret the work of Julian of Norwich. Now, I want to talk briefly about what I refer to as loss of soul. This is a section in chapter 1 of the Complete Guide to Aromatherapy, because the work of Julian of Norwich actually introduces that notion and phenomena of the soul. And I believe, as many other aromatherapists believe, that aromatherapy is so unique and it contributes to the realization of health that no other science can. It accepts and it integrates what we've referred to as the soul. I refer to the work of Schnabel, and Schnabel says that aromatherapy seeks to unite the body and the soul. So it is not surprising, therefore, that Julian's mystical insights can inspire us to reconnect with the divine. And in doing so, it gives us a new understanding, a new way in which we can integrate the body, mind, and soul. Now, I did a masterclass, which is still available if you go to my website. And the masterclass was the first of a series of masterclasses that I did when I launched my book. And the first one was called Re-Shamanizing Aromatherapy. And I spoke about the role of the shaman. And in chapter 1 and in my masterclass, we explored the role of the shaman in traditional societies. And I asked the question, where have all the shamans gone? And interestingly, I also asked, why in particular did historians largely ignore the role of women in shamanic practices? Now, I referred to a wonderful book by Ted Locke, The Women in the Shaman's Body, Reclaiming the Feminine in Religion and Medicine. And in this book, Ted Locke talks and provides us with much evidence about the important role that women play as shamans, even though historians have largely neglected this. Now, in the same way that Ted Locke provides us with this evidence to indicate that women played a very important role in shamans, contemporary academics and writers introducing us to Julian of Norwich remind us that women also played a very important role as mystics within the early Christian churches to help all of humankind to embrace the divine. Now, in chapter 1, I also refer to, and you'll see where I'm going with this, there is a part, I talk about traditional spirituality. And I refer to a book written by Lambert called Wise Women of the Dreamtime. And this book looks at and examines traditional Aboriginal spiritualities and traditional shamanic practices within traditional Aboriginal culture. Now, Lambert states she is concerned with Western culture's blatant disregard and desecration of the life-sustaining spiritual relationship that has always existed between humans and our natural habitat, which Aboriginals deem necessary for health. She says, I'll skip this slide. So this is what I'm going to refer to here. She says the overwhelming despair, the resignation and the terror that arise as we helplessly witness and participate in the malignant population explosion, the tormenting rape of the natural world can only be healed if we view it through the ancient eyes of shamanic cultures. Now, what I'm getting to here is that these shamanic cultures that we're talking about are really spiritual practices. And spirituality was integrated with the healing. It was integrated with our understanding of our environment. Now, that has been lost within spiritual practices of many of the more traditional spiritual practices that exist in the 21st century, the Western spiritual practices. Fox actually asked, what if we had, because where this journey is taking us to is that in one way, the work of Julian actually reconnects us with a spirituality which is more respectful of our environment, of the world, of others around us. Now, it's very interesting because there is a paper that was published a few years ago now, and it was referred, and I remember Ruth Barkin actually interviewed me in preparing this paper, and her paper is called Aromatherapy and the Mixed Blessings of Feminization. Now, Barkin contends that aromatherapy is culturally identified as a feminine practice because of the traditional association with smell and the emotions, memory, and the unconscious. She suggests that aromatherapy manages to recombine the separated realms of sensuality, spirituality, medicine, healing, and revive religious meanings and uses of scent. Now, she's nailed it. This is exactly why I'm talking about Julian of Norwich. She, however, may suggest that this feminization is an ambiguous blessing for aromatherapy, which struggles to assert itself legitimately in the quest for scientific validation, which is very much a masculine, male style validation and a more radically inclusive holism. So you can see why, and if you do have a copy of volume 3, The Psyche and the Subtle, please do take the time to reread chapter 1, because it will be very, very, very thought-provoking. Now, my point is that while this might be, is this such a bad thing? Because I believe that all of us involved in the healing practices need to embrace the feminine. As Lambert argues, she says that the feminine must be fully present and empowered on earth and in society so that the healing of humanity's rebirth can begin. So if Barkin describes aromatherapy as a feminized practice, it may very well be that aromatherapy can act as the catalyst for transformation and healing the deep structures in our society that help to generate the bias that exists. And in doing so, we might see a more holistic approach to our health and well-being, a more holistic approach to the way in which we deal with a lot of the calamities and that are existing as we speak now. Now, I do believe that the pandemic in a way has acted. If we take on the wisdom of Julian of Norwich, we need to see what good has come out of this COVID-19 pandemic. And in one way, what we can say is it has helped us to discover spiritual mystics such as Julian of Norwich. And I hope that as we come to the end of this pandemic, I hope that it will continue to give us the strength and the courage to help us embrace and empower the feminine that is needed to act as a catalyst for change in everything that is going on. Now, there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about before we speak about Julian of Norwich, which I'm referring to in chapter 1 of Reshamanizing Aromatherapy. I refer to the work of Tacy, whose book is The Edge of the Sacred, Jung, the Psyche and Earth. And by the way, all the references that I referred to can be found in that blog on my website. And you'll get the links to those in an email. Now, Jung talks about it's easier sometimes to take on the spirituality and the trappings of an exotic cosmology rather than face the poverty of our souls and begin a dialogue with the inner life. Now, I might be speaking out of turn here and I might be wrong. I don't know if this is a fact, so somebody might want to fact check me, but I wonder if you actually knew about Julian of Norwich, because maybe, and if we had known about Julian of Norwich at this time, maybe we wouldn't be so obsessed as Westerners trying to take on how Tacy refers to it, is we have stolen these, in a way we have appropriated, I don't like using the word stolen, but this is the word that Tacy uses when we take on other traditional spiritual practices from traditional peoples around the world. Such souls, and a lot has been spoken about this, whether it be, and especially in terms of aromatherapy and some of the essential oils that we use, and if they are culturally appropriate for us to be using them within the modern context that we use them, and whether it has just been something that has been commercialized. But this Tacy says such stolen property would not take root in the white soul, and it may actually inhibit or block a developmental process already taking place. We know we are spiritually bereft, but the way ahead may not be by the means of returning to animism or ancestor spirits. Now, here specifically, he's talking about more traditional practices and shamanic practices. Now, what I actually believe is maybe Tacy also wasn't aware of Julian of Norwich, because maybe if we had known about Julian of Norwich, we would not be, as Tacy says, so spiritually bereft. Okay, so I do believe that for some of us, that Julian of Norwich offers us a unique opportunity to reconnect with our own spiritual cosmologies, our own spiritual heritage, and one that still has meaning in the 21st century. So this is why I'm suggesting that her work is so important, and why so many others suggest that her work is so important, and how I think it's so beautifully what I've just mentioned about aromatherapy, how her work purely adds that extra layer of dimension to understanding the essential oils. And this is what I will do in finishing off this presentation. Now, let's actually have a look now at Julian's world. Now, we don't know too much about the true identity of Julian of Norwich. She wasn't so interested in writing about herself. She doesn't tell us much about her life. So most of the works that you'll see written about the history of Julian of Norwich are kind of speculating. One, they speculate that she may have been a Benedict nun because she knew how to write, and unless you were connected to a monastery in those time, in that period, 600 years ago, it's very unlikely that you would have been able to read or write. But there is no actual evidence, documented evidence, to suggest that she was actually connected to the Benedict nunnery of Caro. Now, another theory is that she may have received some early schooling from the nuns, and indeed they may have also, the Benedict nuns may have provided some support in her years as an anchoress, which we'll talk about soon. But what we do know from history is that her texts survived the centuries through copies that were made later by exiled English Benedict nuns. Others suggest that she might have been a widow who then became anchoress. And it's also believed that Julian may have experienced the death of a child during the plague in the late 1340s. But the only thing that she does tell us about is, and she's very specific, not just 30 and a half years old, she tells us, and this can be found in the long text, she tells us what happened. And in blue, these are her words. And when I was 30 and a half years old, God sent me a bodily sickness in which I lay for 3 days and 3 nights. And on the 4th night, I received all the rites of the Holy Church and did not expect to live until morning. And after this, I lingered on for 2 days and 2 nights. And on the 3rd night, I often thought I was about to die. It is not surprising that she had these visions. And so did those who were with me. So she was on her deathbed. And being still young, I thought it was a great pity to die. So she's writing this later as she reflects. But this was not because of anything on earth that I wanted to live for, nor because I was afraid of any pain, for I trusted in God's mercy. But it was because I wanted to live so as to have loved God better and for longer, in order that I might, through the grace of living, have more knowledge and love of God in the bliss of heaven. Now, I find that very interesting motivation, not due to her earthly connections, her desire to live, but her desire to have a deeper connection with the divine, a deeper connection with God, and that she might have more knowledge and an understanding, so that she might, if we look at a more contemporary Western translation, achieve a state of transcendence so that she can better understand what life is all about. Now, this text, as I said, it's in the long text, and it's found in section 3. Now, when she was close to death, she experiences 16 revelations of Christ dying on the cross. And we'll talk more about the way that the book was written very soon. So she wrote 2 versions of her visionary experience. The first was known as the short text, which was most likely written within a short period after she recovered from this illness in which she died. The second is known as the long text, and you could think of this more as a meditative commentary devoted to exploring and to interpreting what had been shown to her in her visions. And this, the long text, was written during her time when she became an anchoress. Now, several people, and I'm not going to go through this in any much detail, but I know that people say, yeah, but she decided to live the life of an anchoress. And look, life was not as stressful back in the 14th century as it is in the actual 21st century. Well, let me correct you. Let's look at this. In the early 1300s, there's the start of a 100-year war with France. Now, I'm not up with my history. I wish I'd done more with my history, but I'm assuming that this war went on for about 100 years. Now, she was born in 1343. The first plague, the Black Death, reaches England. Well, this is actually not the first, but this, in her time, it reached England in 1349. Now, we're talking about in 1381, there was this peasants' revolt, and they killed a chancellor. Now, the chancellor, which I believe, it would be like, how would you think of doing that in the 21st century? It would be like, okay, let's knock off the Prime Minister because we are not happy with the way he's managed the pandemic. Let's take him to the tower and take him and chop and off with his head. This is what happened in this time because there was so much civil unrest in the period in which we speak. So many people had died because of the Black Death, and people were nourished. There was not enough food, and so no wonder there was a lot of civil unrest. Now, in 1383, Henry Despenser, who was the Bishop of Norwich, decides to lead men off on a crusade as well. In 1390, Julian takes the vows as an anchoress and enters the small cell which is attached to the church of St. Julian. And it's believed the approximate date in which she starts writing the Revelations of Divine Love in 1395, in 1416. So she spends almost 30 years in this cell. And this she chose to do. Now, it's very interesting that one of the first modern books published was in 1877. And then in 1901, another version is published. And in 2001, Julian's words, "All will be well," are included in the Queen Jubilee's window at St. James Palace. Now here is, and I found these on Wikipedia, and I do wish to go there one day soon, and I do believe, and I hope you are listening, we do have somebody who had sent an email saying, "I'm actually from Norwich." I actually got really nervous when you mentioned this, so please correct me if I'm not correct in what I've said. I'm from Norwich, and I'm looking forward to learning about Julian of Norwich. Actually, I have a very interesting story to tell about that too. Now, the photo on the left is actually, I think it's the second one. Now, this church was actually destroyed in the Second World War. So I think it was rebuilt in around the 1950s. Now, I do not know if it was, I'm sure that it would have been rebuilt as authentic as the original St. Julian's Church, but in the back there, that is the cell that they are referring to, in which Julian spent almost 30 years of her life in this small cell. Now, the life of an anchoress was basically regarded as the living death of one who was as if dead to the world. It's not like, "Oh, Jesus, I've changed my mind. Can I get out?" Because once you made that commitment, you were committed. And so there would have been some, and there would have been, from what I read, there would have been some probationary testing to ensure that she was aware of the commitment she was going to make, because she wasn't the only one to do this. This was very common in this time that we speak about. And also, of course, not surprisingly, that there was sufficient arrangements for her continued material support so that she could be fed and so on and taken care of. She would have had some companions designated to take care of her, and these responsibilities would have included things such as bringing food to her, bringing drink and laundry and so on. We do know that Marguerite Kemp, Norfolk visionary and holy woman, had a meeting with her. So people were able to go up to the windows, and they were able to they were able to speak with Julian. They were able to get spiritual advice. She actually became quite famous for the spiritual advice that she actually offered people. Now, you've got to remember as well, I've got some statistics about the period in which Julian lived. Norwich, in the 14th century, Norwich had the population of about 25,000 people. It was then the second largest town in England when it was struck down by the plague, known as the Black Death. It was responsible for killing approximately 3/4 of the population of Norwich. And I imagine this was throughout most of Europe as well. So you can understand the social and the cultural context of the time. It was saturated with suffering. It is not surprising that many interpreted these as clear signs of God's anger with humanity. So keep that in mind, because we'll come back to that. Now, this is a reconstruction of Julian's cell. Now, at St. Julian's Church of Norwich. So you can see the way that they've reconstructed it. It's actually quite comfortable, isn't it? Now, I do want to talk now. As I said, Julian's Church was rebuilt in the 1950s following the destruction in the Second World War from a German bombing. The new construction site now has included the reconstruction of Julian's anchor hold, the cell, which had been lost at the time of the Reformation. So at the period of the Reformation, that would have disappeared. The Reformation, which occurred later, was a time of even more upheaval. It has now become very much a pilgrimage destination and considered to be something of a shrine associated with the Julian Centre. And since 1980, Julian of Norwich has had her feast day on the 8th of March in the Church of England's calendar. Now, I have something very interesting to tell you, because in 1973, I think this was when they were going to be celebrating, it was like the 600th anniversary of Julian of Norwich. The people of Norfolk, and this is from a book by Sheila Upjohn, In Search of Julian of Norwich, and she tells this very interesting story. On the 8th of May, 1973, a distinguished company from all over the world gathered in the Norwich Cathedral for a celebration. Back in those days, the people of Norwich were astonished to find that it wasn't purely a Church of England affair. Roman Catholics, many of them priests, monks and nuns, had come from America, from France, from Italy to pray beside all kinds of churchmen from all over the world. At the Eucharist, celebrated by an Anglican priest, it was the first time there was such a gathering. That when they say it was the first time that a Roman Catholic priest had been officially present at the Eucharist in the cathedral since Henry VIII had dissolved the priory in 1538. All of the people of Norwich heard of this and approved, but their discomfort grew. The reason was this. The celebration was to honour the 600th anniversary of Julian of Norwich. And most of them had to admit they had never heard the name. Who was this man? Now I'm reading this text from this book, In Search of Julian of Norwich. Who was this man, and how had the inhabitants of this native city remained unaware of his existence for 600 years? Their embarrassment became acute when it was revealed to them that their ignorance was deeper than they supposed. Julian, it seemed, was not a man after all, but a woman who lived in Norwich 600 years before and had written a book. So I thought that I had to share that with you. That's quite an interesting story. Now, her text has been described as something like, so even we don't know what educational background she had, but it shows her intellect and her knowledge of spiritual writing. And more interesting, her book, the text did not have any direct citation to other sources or biblical references. And it's written in such a stylistic subtlety and grace. And it is also theologically precise. So this is what's amazing about this text. Now, for example, she declares that God is our mother. Now, mind you, it was not uncommon in this period, in the medieval period, for monks and nuns to write about Jesus as the mother who feeds and nourishes us. Julian also then dispels these images of God as an avenging God, as a God that is punishing humans for being evil. She allows us to open our minds, our heart, and our imagination so that we may receive the divine love that sustains and cares for us. Now, it's very interesting that her books, her writing really remain hidden for such a long period. And I want to discuss how it came to be found. Now, Ramirez so beautifully, and please, this is such gorgeous advice, if you read her entire book. Of all the works I have read, hers is one I most want to read passage by passage, phrase by phrase, word by word. As she gave time in writing it, 30 years or more, 30 years, we must give time in reading it. The rewards are immense. What beautiful advice to follow when you decide to read the revelations of divine love. Now, what we do know is also that she was one of the first women to write in English. Now, what people don't say is that she's not the first to have her book published in English. Now, most of the spiritual texts that would have been written in that time would have been written in Latin. So it's very interesting that she wrote in what is referred to in Middle English. Now, there would have been a lot of challenges in writing this, and who knows if it had actually been kept hidden from the establishment at the time, because Ramirez also says scholarship, spirituality, study, these were the preserve of men rather than women. So for a woman to write a book in the 14th century was both dangerous and difficult. Now, don't tell me that back then, Julian is not breaking the bias. My word, she's breaking the bias. Now, Julian's book, it's understood, was nearly lost to the fires of the reformers and the passages of time. But over 6 centuries it survived, and it survived thanks, and I won't go into the entire history, but it's in the blog that I've written, the entire history of how this book has survived. Now, when it was first discovered in the mid-1600s by an English Benedict monk, he was fascinated by it. And he got permission. And by the way, the book was discovered. We don't know if the original manuscript exists. It would have been rewritten, and books would have been made by scribes who copied by scribes. So we know that that edition that was discovered in France, that was taken as the Benedict nuns fled England during the Reformation, and it survived in Paris. What we know is it survived in Paris. Now, this English Benedict monk found the book and decided to do the first ever printed edition of Julian's book. Now, at the time that this book was printed in the 1600s, there was Bishop Stillington, and this is the sort of criticism that it faced. Bishop Stillington declared it a fantastic revelation of a distempered brain. I doubt very much if Bishop Stillington had truly read it. I doubt that he had truly read it, or he wouldn't have said that. Now, Julian wrote in this Middle English, which is not as complicated to read as some of the other 14th century text. Now, we won't go into, and maybe this will be a presentation for the future, because she wasn't the only female mystic. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, also wrote in the same in the same style that Julian of Norwich writes. Now, I want to now briefly speak about, and this is now more the work of Matthew Fox. But Matthew Fox is correct in what he says when he suggests that perhaps that Julian of Norwich was indeed she was a practitioner of what he refers to as creation spirituality. This is interesting. Let me explain what Fox means. He describes creation spirituality as the synthesis of wisdom drawn from indigenous cultures, mystical traditions of the West, world religions, and scientific cosmologies to explain and cosmological explanations of the world. Creation spirituality also draws on movements in social justice, feminism, environmentalism, and process thought. So this is a term that Matthew Fox has created. Now, what he's suggesting is, in many ways, what I suggest is, in many ways, this is the same, in the same way that those of us who practice holistic health, in part of the holistic health movement, we argue for a more inclusive approach to health and well-being that embraces traditional healing practices, that embraces both science and spirituality. So hence, in many ways, when Matthew Fox talks about creation spirituality, we can relate to that to our practice of aromatherapy, because creation spirituality asks for an acceptance of the sacredness and mysteries of all of life. Now, Fox goes on to explain in more detail, and in the blog you'll see there's more information about this. Fox states that creation-centered consciousness can be found in the oldest traditions of the Hebrew Bible and in the reflections of other medieval Christian mystics such as Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen, and Mechard of Magdeburg, and of course, Julian of Norwich. Now, interesting, this association. And now let's not hope the same thing. We have changes for the worse. Hopefully, now that we've got the wisdom of Julian of Norwich, we can avoid this. But Fox argues that the Black Death, the plague that was not just responsible for killing 2/3 of the population in Europe, but it was also responsible for killing creation spirituality. And he says, humanity shrunk its soul and came to see itself in a battle against nature. Religion and culture gradually elevated fear of nature over the trust in it, eventually making life after death more important than life before death. And obsessive preoccupation with redemption overtook the love of creation in religion. I want you to go back and think of what Julian said on her deathbed when she knew that she was not going to die. It was her love of life. Even though she was facing death and accepted her death, she knew that she was given a second chance. Now, it's very interesting because I now want to finish off on referring to making the association between the wisdoms of Julian and aromatherapy. Now, I don't know how many times I've referred to, and if Susan Fisher-Rizzi was getting a royalty, she'll be quite well off now, simply because I keep referring to her beautiful phrase in which she describes essential oils as having the ability to reconnect us with our spirituality, because they have the ability to touch our soul and to touch our heart and open the door to our soul, pretty much like the work of Julian of Norwich. Furthermore, she says, This is now Susan Fisher-Brizzi, by the way. Sorry for confusing you. Furthermore, she says, essential oils give us the impetus for the meaning in our life. Now, how on earth am I going to make some connection with all of the words and wisdom of Julian Norwich? It would take forever. And one day, maybe that is a task that I will take on. But for now, I wanted some guidance, and I decided to refer to Matthew Fox's book and how Matthew Fox had actually written his book. He decided he wrote about 7 lessons in which he felt were more important, 7 lessons of Julian of Norwich, which he feels would help us to navigate the pandemic and to grow spiritually in the process. So I've decided to use those 7 quotes, those 7 lessons within the framework in which Matthew Fox talks about. So let me go through each of them. Now, Julian's quote is in red. So I will first refer to her words, and then we will reflect on the meaning. One of the first lessons: sometimes we experience such darkness that we lose all energy. The spiritual reflection here is that the dark night of the soul. And what we can learn is we can learn to find our purpose, and we can develop our resilience. Now, the dark night of the soul is something, and this might have actually been a catalyst. Think of for those of you that are aromatherapists, what was the catalyst for some of us that change our direction, our path in life? We often experience that dark night of the soul, which gives us that revelation that we need to change the path that we are on. Now, Julian's lesson here is about the dark night, is that we must face it. Do not give in to it. Put truth first. Go into the dark, even the darkest of the dark. Julian acknowledges all our frailties and failings, our betrayals and denials, our humiliations and burdens. All our woes seem to utterly fill the horizons of this life. And she often describes and confesses to experiencing a constant flow of woe here in this life. But she also reminds us not to lose touch with the truth of the goodness of life and of nature, even in the most challenging of times. Now, what I've decided to do is, which essential oils give us the courage to face the dark night of the soul? And I felt I've chosen these intuitively, and I feel that you may be able to add to this list, but I chose oils like cedarwood, benzoin, black pepper, cistus, German chamomile, everlasting, fregonia, frankincense, ginger, lavender, myrrh, neroli, peppermint, rosemary, sage, sandalwood, and yakusugi. Now, what I've done is, because at the end of this presentation, I create a blend, a Julian of Norwich blend. So here I've chosen one of the oils in this list, which is the first oil in my blend, and it's fregonia oil. I've been thinking about what has been going on in Australia at the moment, whether it was the bushfires at one end of the pandemic and hopefully we will see the end of the floods, which are now, by the way, that really heavy storm, that cell of rain has moved from southeast Queensland all the way into New South Wales, just wreaking havoc and devastation. So I hope that we will soon see, even though it's going to not take days, it could take months, if not longer, for many people to recover from this most devastating flood, which has gone all the way from Brisbane all the way down through to Sydney now. But fregonia, I think, is such a beautiful oil that can help give us the courage to face the dark night of the soul. And Robbie Zeck described it so beautifully, like a candle carrying the light of dignity, nurturing the spirit, helping you to come to terms and resolve past traumas and unresolved family issues. It gently helps to remove scars from painful emotional pain. Perfect to reflect on Julian's lesson here. Sometimes we experience such darkness that we lose all our energy. Fregonia helps us to see through the darkness and regain our energy, as do these other oils. Now, in the blog, there is a list. I've made a summary as well based on the work of Matthew Fox about some more of the essence of Julian's lesson here. I won't. I'm just wary of the time. I won't go through each of these points, but please go to refer to that blog, and I'm sure that you will relate to many of Julian's lessons here. Now, another beautiful lesson of Julian's is God is all that is good. God says, I am the sovereign goodness of all things. Here, the spiritual lesson is all wonder and gratitude. All I will say here is, and I speak about this extensively in chapter 4 of the volume 3, where we talk about the science behind awe and the spiritual connection that it has. The reason that I discovered essential oils and became an aromatherapist is because I was in awe of essential oils. But which essential oils allow you to experience that feeling of awe and feeling of joy, a feeling of gratitude and wonderment? My favorite oils included cedarwood, bergamot, cardamom, chamomile, Roman chamomile, clary sage, fregonia, enoki wood, sweet orange, geranium, lavender, mandarin, neroli, rose, sandalwood, and ylang ylang. I am sure that you have others that also elicit that feeling of awe and feeling of joy. My choice was bergamot in particular. It has this beautiful warm quality to it. It helps you regain that sense of self-confidence. It's very uplifting and it revitalizes your spirit. There's a sense of wonderment. It's got this beautiful citrus note, and yet it's got this really evocative, rich floral note as well. It evokes joy and it warms the heart. Now, with this there are many lessons within this particular aspect of what Julian is talking about. But here Julian is basically saying us to find joy in nature, and that find the goodness in life, and that God is unending goodness. We are all born, and it's our birthright, for never-ending joy. Value all. A reverent awe is the proper response to the beauty of the divine. And don't forget to practice gratitude. Now, another beautiful saying of Julian's, another lesson is God is the same thing as nature. So what does Julian talk about here? She talks about grace. She talks about connectedness and harmony with nature. And I throw in a more modern interpretation because I feel that this is that connection with nature. That biophilia, which the term now is biophilia, is very important for experiencing awe, but in order to have that spiritual connection with nature. Now, the type of essential oils that elicit that connection and harmony with nature are, once again, the rich, I've chosen here some very fresh citrus, florals, and herbaceous aromas. Very interesting. My favorite is something like black spruce. Black spruce teaches us to walk our spiritual path with practical feet, moving forward and making choices with grounded wisdom and intuitive understanding. And this is exactly what Julian is talking about when she refers to grace. Spruce supports intuition and teaches us compassion. And spruce also awakens that deep, innate spiritual bond that we have always had with nature. Now, some of the essence of Julian's lesson here is, and you've got to remember that in this period in which we speak, people were frightened of nature, that people were frightened of God. They felt that the Black Plague was a punishment from God. But Julian reminds us that about the good things and the goodness of nature. She reminds us that nature and grace are in harmony with each other, and they do not work without each other. And very interesting words that she uses. God is the true father and mother of nature. And another interesting one, I have to mention this, is between God and the soul, there is no between. They are one. So you can understand that Julian's teachings, Julian's revelations are very much aligned with the way in which many traditional practices, spiritual practices, view the world. Now, this one is also such a beautiful revelation of Julian. God feels a teaching of Julian. God feels great delight to be our father, and God feels great delight to be our mother. So here, Julian is reminding us of the divine feminine, but there needs to be that balance between the masculine and the feminine. But we really need to find the time to reconnect with the divine feminine. And this is why I was referring earlier on about the practice of aromatherapy and how I think essential oils are incredible in terms of helping us to reconnect with the divine feminine. There are several oils that I list here, but the one that I have particularly chosen is rose. The scent of rose has always been associated with the divine feminine energy. Rose has been described as a miracle of nature. Now, I love here Malibu's description of rose when he says to smell rose refines our sensitivity. It takes us to an unknown world and disperses the shadows of our worries, our anxieties, and our sorrow. It shows us love. This is very powerful, and this is exactly what Julian talks about. It shows us love, not only human love, which is a gift as it is, possibly the finest from existence, but spiritual love, and we would even say divine love. How beautiful. I hope you see this very strong connection with this particular wisdom of Julian and Rose, Otto or Rose Absolute. Now, the essence here of the essence of Julian's lesson is basically the divine feminine and motherhood of God are integral to what she refers to as the Trinity and Godhead. Mother God suffers when Mother Earth suffers. The lessons here are also stand up to the patriarchal vengeance and wrath, for they are found in us, not in the divine. And here the lesson is also compassion. Compassion belongs to motherhood. So compassion protects and increases our sensitivity, gives life, and it heals. Now, very interesting, and I love this word, and it's pity. I don't think it's used anymore. The term is wanting. Other mystics and academics have come up with their own terms, such as experiencing ecstasy, breakthrough, peak experience, or flow. Wanting is Julian's word for the mystical experience. Julian explains that the fruit and the purpose of prayer is to be one with and like God in all things. Wanting is perhaps when we are in a state of meditation. When we meditate, we may be experiencing this state, this term that Julian refers to as wanting. Now, the actual lesson that Julian gives us is between God and our soul. There is no between. So here the spiritual lesson is one of non-dualism. And she spoke a lot about this, about identity and transcendence. Now, those essential oils that elicit this state of non-dualism and experience of wanting, I felt include oils like cedarwood, frankincense, hinoki, lavender, neroli, patchouli, vetiver, and sandalwood. And I'm sure you will agree with me, have chosen sandalwood. It is the aromatic ingredient of choice around the world, and because it symbolizes this bond between humanity and the divine. And I think Worwood here, Valerie Ann Worwood, beautifully embodies the words of Julian in describing the more subtle properties of sandalwood. Sandalwood helps humanity to have the strength of conviction when standing against adversity, as it rejects all aspects of being. It rejoices in the physical aspect of humanity while also being aware of the spiritual self. In other words, it elicits a state of what Julian refers to as wanting. The essence of Julian's lessons. There exists a true wanting between the divine and the humans. But it also, she goes on to say, do not give in to our negative impulses, or we remain in this muddle all the days of our life. Also, trust in the basis of compassion and trust in the real meaning of faith. Now, I think we're coming to the end. There's actually two more lessons that I want to share with you, Julian's lessons. God is our sensuality, and I understand that our sensuality is grounded in nature, in compassion, and in grace. The spiritual lessons here is simply trusting our sensuality, trusting our body, and to have courage. Now, it's very interesting. I thought I'd have to share this with you. Fox, in this section, Matthew Fox, is very critical of the patriarchal relationship that has always existed with the body within the church. For example, he reminds us of Cardinal Ratzinger, who eventually became Pope Benedict XVI. He published a document declaring, and I actually went looking for this document and actually found it. He published a document declaring that Christians should not learn yoga because it might get you too in touch with your body. Julian says that we need to connect and embrace with our body, because if we do not, how can we connect with the divine? She reminds us that both our substance and sensuality together might be referred to as the soul, and that this is because they are both one in God. Now, the type of essential oils that allow us to trust our sensuality and unite the body, mind, and soul. I've listed all these rich, beautiful resin oils, sweet citrus oils, and floral oils, but jasmine is my choice of oil. Jasmine promotes love and sensuality. Jasmine connects our spirituality to our sexuality here. And I wanted to share, different aromatherapists' words of wisdom and descriptions. And these can all be found in the last chapter of Volume 3, by the way, in which I describe the more subtle qualities of the essential oils. But here I love Lavab's description of jasmine, it beautifully embodies the essence of Julian when he says that jasmine releases inhibition, it liberates the imagination, it develops an exhilarating playfulness and has the power to transcend physical love, fully releasing both the male and female sexual energy. And once again, referring to this wanting. Now, Julian further goes on to give us some wonderful advice, which I've made a list of here. So once again, please refer to my blog. Now, the last one that I want to talk about is one of the lessons that Julian gives us, and there are many, many of them, is we were made for love. It amuses me that the Lord of love overcomes the spirit of evil. Here, the spiritual lesson is to embrace and understand the power of love, the hope and compassion. Julian says that we are surrounded in love. Love is everywhere. After all, what is the title of her book? It is called The Revelations of Divine Love. Even though her revelations were seeing images of Christ suffering on the cross, the title of the book is not the suffering of Jesus, but the revelations of divine love. It's not surprising that I've chosen oils like chamomile, fregonia, lavender, melissa, but of course, my oil of choice here is lavender essential oils because it beautifully embodies this, the message of this particular lesson. Lavender embodies the protective nature of Mother Earth, and it helps us to integrate our spirituality into everyday life. Robbie Zeck here beautifully reminds us of the nurturing nature of lavender, the loving nature of lavender. It brings nourishment and reassurance whenever we need to navigate the challenges of life. Now, what I want to do now is, from these particular lessons that we have explored, I have decided, by the way, this is the essence of this particular lesson of Julian's, in which she refers to goodness and love go together, love being a response to the good. We are made for love. Now, this is the blend that I've created. I'd like you to experiment. You may be using, if you need some guidance, use that list, create your own blend. Try this blend, but this is a blend in honor of Julian of Norwich. You can add these drops to a diffuser, or you can make a massage oil with these beautiful oils I've chosen: fregonia, bergamot, black pepper, black spruce, rose otto, sandalwood, jasmine absolute, and lavender. Now, I'd like to finish off. I'm just aware of the time. My webinars, I thought, would only go for about an hour, but I do want to finish off by just saying, why Julian, why now, and why was her book ignored for so long? Now, Fox describes Julian as this very deeply aware, conscious woman who believed in her experience as a woman. And I loved it. I love this reflection of her. And she trusted her insight. She trusted her intuition, her vision, her experience, and her learning. Fox knows a little bit about chakras when he says she trusted her fifth chakra, her throat chakra, to speak out, to find her voice, because you've got to remember it would have been a challenging time to write about these visions and these revelations, to tell her truth and the wisdom as she knows it. She spoke out about womanhood, about mothering and the divine mother. She insisted on the feminine side of God. She was a champion of non-dualism, and this means she was a feminist. Fox, however, says that what happened, Fox states that the cause, what basically happened, why was Julian for so long suppressed? Fox suggests that the cause lies deep in the rejection of nature as being sacred, in the exploitation of nature that capitalism and patriarchy have engaged non-stop for centuries. He says the denial of climate change and the science is part of this acting from a reptilian brain that patriarchy is famous for. The matricide, the killing of the Mother Earth, of indigenous religions, the misogyny, and are all part of that sick and toxic masculinity that we need some vaccine to protect us from. And of course, he's suggesting perhaps that the wisdom of Julian of Norwich may be our guide. I've come to the end of the webinar. I am so sorry that it's taken so long. I didn't really want to take any shortcuts in this presentation. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that you will enjoy learning about Julian of Norwich as much as I have, and I hope that it will give you a much deeper awareness of how to use the beautiful essential oils in a more subtle way. Now, which brings me to the next webinar that we'll be doing, which is on essential oils and sustainability. And now I haven't changed the date. That will be sometime in March. And I think as much as essential oils are so beautiful, we need to treasure them and use them wisely because they are gifts from nature. Once again, thank you so much. If you do have any questions or some feedback, please do not hesitate to email me. You can find the link to my email on my website. Please share with me your feedback and your comments. But please enjoy learning more about Julian of Norwich. Thank you so much.